Main area across North Iraq into Syria, which is held by IS. It's worth remembering how fluid that landmass is. The group has territories scattered around the Middle East, but this is their main base. Let's pull out a bit to see who the main players are in the vicinity. There's Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran and Qatar. Why aren't these regional players, Michael, doing more to tackle IS?
Well, I think one of the main problems you have is that the different players view different actors in the region as responsible for the rise of the Islamic State. So take Saudi Arabia, for example, that views Iranian-backed militias in Syria and Iraq as radicalising local Sunnis and driving them towards ISIS. There was then the Houthi militias taking on the government of Yemen, and they also perceive that they're radicalising Sunnis there. So Saudi Arabia has diverted its resources from Syria down to Yemen to combat what it perceives as the Iranian threat, expanding across the region. Qatar has quite a similar line, except it's a lot closer to Turkey, and historically has had an allegiance more to like the Muslim Brotherhood side of things. So both Turkey and Qatar have been working in northern Syria here, but they've not been able, unfortunately, to get a ground in southern Syria and in eastern Syria. So their limited influence is actually hurting their ability to have any political influence on the conflict. They're ultimately aligning with Saudi Arabia against Iran, and they see Iran as the major threat to peace and security. Now, of course, Iran is very, very focused on trying to prop up the regimes in the region against what it sees as destabilization from the Sunni powers. So actually, the conflict between Saudi and Iran is actually affecting this decision to fight ISIS.
Kurdish forces have been particularly effective in fighting IS. Tell us about them.
Yeah, so here we have the YPG, which are the Syrian Kurds. Now, they number around 2 million in Syria. They are basically an offshoot of an organisation called the PKK, which operates in southeastern Turkey and has fought Turkey for a number of years, since 1984. But actually what's happened, the Syrian Kurds since 2012 have begun to find their own voice. And they've begun carving out a stretch of territory in northeastern Syria. They've been fighting back against the Islamic State, and they've received Western backing and support. So what's happened is, of course, that the YPG, with its Western backing and support, has been able to retake more towns against ISIS than any other group on the ground. And so they're almost snowballing effect. The more successful they are, the more support they're getting from the West.
So is an option leaving it to the Syrian Kurds?
Well, no, ultimately, because Syria is a multi-ethnic country. The Kurds operate largely in this area here. And they can operate in their areas. They have a large constituency and a large following there. But the moment you move further south, this becomes more ethnically Arab. Arabs there have been already saying that they're very worried about the Kurds coming into their territory to govern them. So what we need to find, actually, is a number of Free Syrian Army factions that can operate in alliance with the Kurds, that can work to push Islamic State out of those territories. Because if it's just done by the Kurds, it's unlikely to stabilise the region.
What's Turkey's alternative, then, to the Kurdish forces?
Well, of course, Turkey does not like the rise of the Syrian Kurds. It sees them as linked fundamentally to the PKK in southeastern Turkey, and sees them as one of the same thing. In fact, some Turkish media outlets have called the Syrian Kurds terrorists. So actually, what they are trying to do is work in this area of northwestern Syria alongside the Qataris and the Saudis. And what they're trying to do ultimately is align with the Saudis and the Qataris to fund moderate Islamist groups, but also some quite hard-line Islamist groups in this part of Syria here, which has become increasingly problematic because the lines between moderate Islamist groups and al-Qaeda are becoming blurred, and they're getting support from Turkey, and it's not clear on what side of the line the Turks are standing.
Yeah, I mean, what about for the West? What would a Turkey-Saudi Arabia alliance mean for the West?
Well, ultimately, the Turks and the Saudis can operate in areas where the Russians are not, and where Bashar al-Assad's forces are not. I think what's important to understand is that since Russia has come into the game, this has changed the calculation for Turkey and Saudi Arabia. So their forces are in this area of northwestern Syria here, around Aleppo and Idlib. Now, they can support those forces. They can ensure that Bashar al-Assad does not retake that little part of Syria. But essentially, this area here, alongside Damascus and the western coast, is controlled by Russia and the regime. This is controlled by the Kurds. And actually, this is going to increase the fragmentation of the country, not put it back together again.
So is the only option boots on the ground, then?
Well, it may have to be boots on the ground from regional actors. But as we said in the original question, none of these countries actually view boots on the ground against ISIS as a priority, because obviously the Saudis are more concerned about Iranian interference in the region. If anything, they would deploy militarily against Bashar al-Assad. They would not deploy militarily against ISIS. So that's the problem we've got.
OK, Michael Stevens from RUSI, thank you very much indeed.